The altimeter read 28,000 feet when the compressor seized. Lieutenant Marcus Webb felt the shudder ripple through his P-38 Lightning's left engine before he heard the sickening grind of metal tearing itself apart. Ice crystals had formed in the supercharger, choking the airflow, starving the Allison engine of the breath it needed to survive at altitude. The propeller windmilled uselessly as the engine died, its nacelle now nothing more than dead weight hanging from the wing. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. Below him, 6 Focke-Wulf 190s clawed their way upward, their pilots hungry for an easy kill. Webb's wingman had already spiraled away, his own engine coughing and wheezing in the thin, frozen air. They were alone now, each man fighting his own private war against physics and fate. The Germans knew the weakness. They had studied it, exploited it, turned it into doctrine. Get the Lightning above 25,000 feet and wait. Wait for the cold to do what bullets could not. Webb's gloved hand moved instinctively to the mixture control, then hesitated. What he was about to do violated every manual, every regulation, every piece of wisdom the Army Air Forces had drilled into him. But 3 weeks ago, a civilian with grease under his fingernails and defiance in his eyes had shown him something different, something the engineers at Lockheed had never intended, something that should not work, but did. He twisted the mixture control past Rich, past the stop, into a position that did not officially exist. The right engine coughed once, then roared with a fury that shook the entire airframe. The manifold pressure spiked beyond redline, the cylinder head temperature climbed into dangerous territory. Every instrument screamed warnings that Webb ignored. The P-38 leapt forward as if kicked by an invisible giant, accelerating impossibly at an altitude where most aircraft could barely maintain level flight. The lead Focke-Wulf never saw it coming. Webb dropped from above like a stooping hawk, his twin 50s and single cannon converging in a cone of destruction that tore the German fighter's wing clean off. The remaining 5 scattered, diving for the safety of lower altitudes where their radial engines could breathe freely. But Webb stayed high, dancing at the edge of the stratosphere with a machine that should have been helpless, sustained by a modification that did not exist in any official document. When he landed at the forward strip in Algeria, mechanics swarmed his aircraft. They found the unauthorized bypass valve welded into the fuel system, the hand-filed adjustments to the carburetor, the carefully hidden modifications that transformed a flawed weapon into something approaching invincibility. The commander ordered it removed immediately. Webb refused. By sunset, 3 more pilots had sought out the civilian who had done the work, begging him to do the same to their machines. His name was Samuel Dietrich, and he was about to start a revolution that the Army Air Forces would spend months trying to stop. The war in Europe by the summer of 1943 had entered a new and desperate phase. The initial shock of Pearl Harbor had given way to a grinding attritional struggle across 3 continents. American industry had begun to flex its muscles, pouring forth aircraft, tanks, and ships in numbers that staggered the imagination. Yet for all this material abundance, victory remained frustratingly distant. The Germans fought with a skill and tenacity that demanded respect, even from those who hated them most. Their fighters, particularly the Focke-Wulf 190 and the latest variants of the Messerschmitt 109, were formidable adversaries flown by veterans who had survived years of aerial combat. The Lockheed P-38 Lightning had arrived in European skies carrying enormous expectations. Its twin-boom design made it instantly recognizable, a silhouette unlike any other aircraft in the war. 2 Allison V-1710 engines provided power, while a central nacelle housed the pilot and a devastating array of weapons. 4 50-caliber machine guns and a single 20mm cannon pointed straight ahead, their fire converging at a point where destruction was almost guaranteed. Unlike other fighters that mounted guns in the wings, the P-38's nose armament suffered no convergence issues. What the pilot aimed at, the guns hit. On paper, the Lightning should have dominated. Its speed exceeded that of most German fighters. Its climb rate was impressive. Its range allowed it to escort bombers deep into enemy territory and still have fuel to fight. Yet in practice, the P-38 had become a source of bitter controversy among pilots and commanders alike. Men who flew it returned with stories of engines that quit without warning, of controls that froze solid at high altitude, of compressibility that sent aircraft into uncontrollable dives from which recovery was impossible. The cold was the enemy. Above 25,000 feet, the thin air and sub-zero temperatures conspired against every system the Lightning possessed. The Allison engines, superb at low altitude, gasped and wheezed in the stratosphere. Turbochargers meant to compress the thin air and feed it to the cylinders instead became ice factories, their impellers clogging with frost until airflow ceased entirely. When an engine quit at altitude, it did so with a violence that could tear mountings loose and send the entire nacelle tumbling away from the wing. Pilots developed a grim fatalism about high-altitude operations. They would climb as ordered, form up on the bombers, and pray that the Germans chose to attack from below rather than above. When enemy fighters climbed to meet them, P-38 pilots often found themselves in the helpless position of watching their engines fail one by one while adversaries circled like sharks around wounded prey. Some men simply refused to fly the Lightning anymore, accepting transfers to other units rather than die in a machine they no longer trusted. The engineers at Lockheed knew about the problems. They had known for months. Reports flooded back from every theater where the P-38 operated. Modifications were designed, tested, and approved and slowly worked into the production line. New turbocharger regulators promised better control of boost pressure. Revised intercoolers claimed to prevent ice buildup. Each change represented months of development time, endless meetings, careful documentation, and bureaucratic approval at every level. But the men dying over Germany and North Africa did not have months, they had hours, measured in the time between dawn briefings and the moment they strapped themselves into cockpits and climbed toward an indifferent sky. For them, the careful process of military procurement was an abstraction that meant nothing when an engine quit and German guns opened fire. Into this crisis stepped Samuel Dietrich, though he would have laughed at such dramatic phrasing. Dietrich was 51 years old in the summer of 1943, a civilian contractor who had spent 30 years working on engines of every description. He had started as an apprentice in Detroit, learning the trade in shops where men built racing engines for wealthy enthusiasts who demanded speed above all else. Those engines had no governors, no safety margins, no concessions to reliability. They were built to run at maximum power until they exploded or crossed the finish line, whichever came first. When the Depression hit, Dietrich had drifted west, finding work where he could. He rebuilt tractor engines for farmers, rebuilt truck engines for bootleggers running illegal liquor across state lines, and eventually landed in California, where the infant aviation industry was hungry for men who understood how to coax more power from internal combustion. He worked for several small aircraft companies before the war, earning a reputation as a man who could look at an engine and see not what it was, but what it could become. His appearance gave no hint of genius. Dietrich was short, stocky, with hands permanently stained by oil and a face weathered by
Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now, back to the story.
decades of California sun. He spoke little, preferring to let his work make arguments that words could not. When the war began, he had signed on as a civilian technical advisor with the Army Air Forces, part of a small army of contractors who kept the growing fleet of aircraft flying. His official job was to supervise maintenance on transient aircraft passing through the base at Ougda in Morocco, a dusty collection of tents and half-built runways that served as a waypoint for fighters being ferried to combat units farther east. Dietrich had first seen the problem in March of 1943 when a P-38 landed with one engine completely dead and the other barely running. The pilot, a young lieutenant from Iowa, had nearly made it back from a bomber escort mission before his left engine seized. Only luck and skill had kept him alive long enough to reach friendly territory. When Dietrich tore the engine down, he found the turbocharger impeller encased in ice so thick it could not turn. The engine had been starved of air, running too lean, its pistons scoring the cylinder walls as temperatures climbed beyond tolerance.
He showed the damage to the engineering officer, a captain fresh from right field, who quoted specifications and regulations with the confidence of someone who had never watched a man die because those specifications were inadequate. The captain explained that Lockheed was aware of the issue and working on a solution. New turbocharger regulators were being tested. A fix would be implemented in future production models. Current aircraft would be retrofitted as parts became available. Dietrich asked when that might be. The captain consulted his papers and suggested perhaps 6 months, maybe less if priority could be arranged. 6 months. Dietrich thought about the young lieutenant from Iowa and wondered how many more would die waiting for a proper solution to work its way through the machinery of military bureaucracy. He thanked the captain politely and returned to his workshop, where he spent the night staring at a turbocharger and thinking about bootleggers. The illegal liquor runners he had worked for in the 30s had faced a similar problem. Their trucks needed maximum power to outrun police, but that power had to be available instantly, at any altitude, in any weather. The solution had been crude but effective. Bypass the governors, richen the fuel mixture beyond normal limits, and accept that engines would wear out faster in exchange for performance when it mattered most. Racing engines worked on the same principle. Reliability was sacrificed on the altar of speed. The Allison engines in the P-38 were not supposed to run rich at high altitude. The mixture was carefully leaned out as the aircraft climbed, compensating for the decreasing air density. This was proper engineering, the correct way to operate an internal combustion engine. It was also, Dietrich realized, exactly what allowed ice to form in the turbocharger. Lean mixtures burned hotter, and that heat differential between the engine and the frigid incoming air created the perfect conditions for moisture to freeze. What if, Dietrich wondered, you simply ran the engine rich at altitude, flooded it with fuel, accepted inefficiency, traded economy for heat? The excess fuel would not burn completely, but its presence would cool the combustion chamber. More importantly, the unburned fuel passing through the system would carry heat to the turbocharger, preventing ice formation. The engine would guzzle fuel at an appalling rate. It would foul spark plugs faster. It might even damage cylinders with the constant wash of raw gasoline, but it would run, and a running engine at 28,000 feet was worth more than all the carefully calculated efficiency curves in every engineering manual ever written. He began with his own hands and materials scrounged from the base salvage yard. A simple bypass valve installed in the fuel line, allowing the pilot to override the automatic mixture control. A modified carburetor that could flow more fuel than the engine was designed to handle. The work took 3 nights, performed in secret.
The dim light of a single bulb hanging above his workbench. He told no one what he was doing because he knew what their response would be. Regulations existed for reasons. Modifications required approval. Safety demanded proper testing and documentation. The morning he finished, Dietrich walked across the flight line to where a P-38 sat waiting for a routine test flight. The pilot, a captain named Rodriguez, had been complaining for weeks about engine roughness at altitude. Dietrich found him in the ready room drinking bitter coffee and staring at nothing. He asked Rodriguez if he wanted to stop worrying about his engines quitting. The captain looked at him with the exhausted cynicism of a man who had heard too many promises. But he followed Dietrich to the aircraft anyway. Dietrich showed him the modification. The bypass valve was hidden under a panel in the cockpit, accessible but not obvious. He explained what it did and why it worked, using language stripped of technical jargon. Run it rich when you climb above 20,000 feet. The engine will drink fuel like a drunk sailor, but it will keep running. Ignore what the temperature gauges say. Ignore the book. Trust that the engine can take more abuse than Lockheed thinks it can. Rodriguez stared at the modification for a long moment. He asked if it was authorized. Dietrich said no. He asked if it was safe. Dietrich said probably not. He asked if it would work. Dietrich said yes. Rodriguez climbed into the cockpit without another word and took off into the morning sky. He returned 2 hours later, his face flushed with something that might have been joy or might have been terror.
or might have been both. He had taken the Lightning to 30,000 feet, higher than he had ever dared before. Both engines had run smoothly the entire time, their power available at his slightest touch. He had put the aircraft through maneuvers that should have been impossible at that altitude, testing the limits of what the airframe could withstand. When he landed, he found Dietrich and grabbed him by both shoulders. He wanted the modification on every P-38 in his squadron. He wanted it yesterday. Word spread through the pilot community with the speed that only truly valuable information achieves. By the end of the week, 5 more pilots had sought out Dietrich. They came after dark, not wanting to be seen, bringing bottles of whiskey or cartons of cigarettes as payment. Dietrich refused the gifts, but did the work anyway, his hands moving with practiced efficiency through modifications that took hours but felt like minutes. Each installation was slightly different, adapted to the specific quirks of individual aircraft. The bypass valves were hidden in different locations, camouflaged to escape casual inspection. The modifications left no obvious trace unless someone knew exactly what to look for. The results were immediate and undeniable. Pilots who had been timid about high-altitude combat suddenly became aggressive, knowing their engines would not quit in the middle of a fight. P-38s that had been consistently outperformed by German fighters at altitude now held their own or better. Mission reports began to reflect a change, subtle at first, but growing more pronounced with each passing week. Fewer aborted sorties due to engine failure, more enemy aircraft destroyed, higher pilot confidence. The engineering officer noticed the pattern in early May. He began asking questions, pulling maintenance logs, inspecting aircraft. When he found the first unauthorized modification, his reaction was predictable and explosive. He ordered all modified aircraft grounded immediately pending investigation. He demanded to know who had performed the work and threatened court-martial for anyone involved. He wrote a scathing report to higher headquarters detailing how unauthorized modifications violated every regulation governing aircraft maintenance and safety. Dietrich was summoned to the commander's office, where a colonel with a face like carved granite asked him if he understood the seriousness of what he had done. Dietrich said yes. The colonel asked if he had any idea of the liability the Army Air Forces would face if one of these modified aircraft crashed and killed its pilot. Dietrich said he did. The colonel asked if he had considered that his modifications might weaken engines, causing catastrophic failures that could endanger not just one pilot but entire formations. Dietrich said he had considered it carefully. The colonel leaned back in his chair and asked one more question. Did the modifications work? Dietrich said yes. The colonel drummed his fingers on the desk for a moment, then told Dietrich to get out of his office and to never, under any circumstances, modify another aircraft without proper authorization. Dietrich nodded and left. The modified P-38s remained grounded for 3 days. During that time, the squadron flew combat missions with unmodified aircraft. 2 pilots were forced to abort when their engines failed at altitude. A third barely made it back after both engines quit over enemy territory, coasting the final 30 miles on momentum and prayer. When the squadron returned, the colonel called the engineering officer into his office for a conversation that lasted 15 minutes and ended with the captain leaving white-faced and silent. The next morning, the modified P-38s were quietly returned to service. No announcement was made, no explanation was offered. The official records showed nothing unusual, just routine maintenance completed and aircraft cleared for flight. But every pilot in the squadron understood what had happened. The colonel had made a choice, the kind of choice that commanders in combat have been forced to make since warfare began. He had weighed regulations against results, safety against survival, and decided that men who could fight were worth more than procedures that got them killed. Dietrich went back to work, expecting to be left alone now that his modifications had been tacitly approved. Instead, he found himself busier than ever. Pilots from other squadrons began showing up at Ujda, ferrying their aircraft in with thin excuses about needing maintenance or parts. They would seek out Dietrich, sometimes directly, sometimes through intermediaries who could claim ignorance if questions were asked. The modifications spread like wildfire through the P-38 community. passed along through informal networks that existed parallel to official channels. The engineers at Lockheed heard rumors but could not confirm anything concrete. Reports reached Wright Field of P-38s performing far better than specifications suggested they should, but the data was fragmentary and contradictory. Pilots submitted glowing accounts of aircraft that suddenly seemed immune to the high-altitude engine failures that had plagued the type since its introduction. Maintenance records showed nothing unusual beyond routine work. When investigators arrived to examine the aircraft, they found engines that appeared completely stock, with no obvious modifications visible to casual inspection. Dietrich had learned caution. Each new installation was done more carefully than the last, with modifications hidden in places where only someone who knew exactly what to look for would find them. The bypass valves were disguised as standard fittings. The carburetor modifications were subtle enough to escape notice unless the unit was completely disassembled. He developed a network of trusted mechanics who could perform the work in other locations, spreading the knowledge while maintaining deniability. By June of 1943, dozens of P-38s across North Africa and the Mediterranean carried Dietrich's modifications. The number was impossible to determine precisely because no one kept records of work that was not supposed to exist. Pilots talked about the improvements in vague terms, mentioning better reliability without specifying why. Mechanics performed the work after hours, in private, and then returned to their official duties as if nothing had happened. The Army Air Forces had developed a shadow maintenance system, unauthorized and invisible, that kept its premier long-range fighter competitive against adversaries who should have dominated. The Germans noticed the change but could not explain it. Their intelligence officers collected reports from pilots who described P-38s fighting at altitudes where they should have been helpless. Assessments were revised, tactics adjusted to account for an opponent who no longer behaved according to previous patterns. The Focke-Wulf pilots, who had once eagerly climbed to meet the Lightnings, now found themselves facing aircraft that accelerated impossibly, maneuvered aggressively, and refused to flee when engines should have been failing. Several German aces who had specialized in hunting crippled P-38s found their tactics suddenly ineffective. Their prey transformed into predators. In August, a P-38 with Dietrich's modifications got into a turning fight with a Focke-Wulf 190 at 29,000 feet over Sicily. The German pilot, a veteran with 16 kills, attempted his standard tactic of climbing above the Lightning and waiting for its engines to quit. Instead, the P-38 followed him upward, matching his climb, then accelerating past in a maneuver that should have been aerodynamically impossible at that altitude. The German broke off and dove for lower altitudes, shaken by an encounter that contradicted everything he knew about American fighters. He reported the incident to his squadron commander, who added it to a growing file of similar accounts. Dietrich himself remained at Ujda, working 16-hour days, training other mechanics in his techniques, and slowly refining the modification based on feedback from pilots. He developed different variants for different conditions. A conservative version for pilots who wanted reliability without pushing the limits. An aggressive version for those willing to trade engine life for maximum performance. A compromise that balanced both concerns, suitable for the majority of users. Each variant was carefully documented in notes that Dietrich kept hidden, knowing that someday the Army Air Forces would demand an accounting of what he had done. That accounting would come, but not yet. For now, in the summer of 1943, Samuel Dietrich worked in obscurity, a civilian contractor whose name appeared on no awards and whose contributions were recorded nowhere in official documents. The pilots who trusted him with their lives knew his value. The commanders who quietly allowed his work to continue understood its necessity. The Germans who faced the modified P-38s in combat learned to respect an opponent who had suddenly become far more dangerous. But the revolution Dietrich had started was about to collide with forces larger than one man's ingenuity. The Army Air Forces was not an organization that tolerated irregularity, even successful irregularity. Rules existed for reasons, and those reasons did not disappear simply because someone had found a way to circumvent them. The question was not whether Dietrich's work would be discovered and challenged. The question was when and what would happen to the men who depended on his modifications when authority finally decided to assert itself. Above the Mediterranean, P-38s climbed into hostile skies with engines that hummed smoothly at altitudes where they should have been dying. Their pilots flew with a confidence that came from knowing their machines would not betray them at the worst possible moment. They dove on German fighters, pressed home attacks that would have been suicidal weeks earlier, and returned to base with stories of victories won and lives saved. And in a dusty workshop at Ujda, a civilian with grease under his fingernails prepared for the fight he knew was coming. Not against the Germans, who he would never see, but against his own side, against the regulations and procedures and proper channels that moved too slowly to save lives, against the comfortable certainty of engineers who had never watched a man struggle with a dying aircraft, against the institutional inertia that preferred failure by the book to success that violated the rules. Samuel Dietrich was about to discover that sometimes the hardest battles are fought not against the enemy,
against those who should be your allies. The telegram arrived at Ujda on September 12, 1943, carried by a courier who drove through the night from Algiers. Major General Howard Breckinridge would be arriving in 48 hours to conduct a comprehensive inspection of all P-38 units operating in the theater. His specific mandate included investigation of reported irregularities in aircraft performance that could not be explained by standard specifications. Every aircraft was to be made available for examination. Every maintenance log was to be ready for review. Any unauthorized modifications were to be reported immediately. The base commander read the telegram 3 times before calling his senior staff into a meeting that lasted past midnight. The engineering officer argued for immediate compliance, insisting that all modified aircraft be grounded and returned to standard configuration before the general arrived. The operations officer countered that such action would effectively cripple their combat capability just as a major offensive was being planned. The intelligence officer remained silent, knowing that whatever decision was made would be documented and scrutinized for years to come. Samuel Dietrich learned of the inspection from a young mechanic who burst into his workshop at 2 in the morning. The kid was barely 20, fresh from technical school, and terrified that he would be court-martialed for assisting with unauthorized work. Dietrich sent him away with reassurances he did not feel, then sat alone in the darkness considering his options. He could remove every modification before the inspection, destroying weeks of work and leaving pilots vulnerable again. He could flee, disappearing into the chaos of wartime North Africa before questions were asked. Or he could stay and face whatever consequences came, trusting that results might matter more than regulations. By dawn, he had made his decision. He would stay, but he would not make it easy for them. The modifications would remain in place, hidden as carefully as his skills allowed. If the general's inspectors were thorough enough to find them, then perhaps those inspectors deserved to know what they had discovered. If not, then the work would continue, and pilots would keep flying with the advantages his ingenuity had provided. The next 2 days passed in a frenzy of activity that looked like preparation, but was actually concealment. Mechanics worked around the clock, not to remove modifications, but to hide them better. Bypass valves were relocated to even more obscure positions. Carburetor adjustments were made microscopically smaller, their effects unchanged, but their visibility reduced to near invisibility. Wiring was rerouted through existing conduits, making the modifications appear to be original equipment to anyone who did not know the lightning systems. Pilots were briefed separately, told to say nothing about performance improvements unless directly asked. If questioned, they were to describe their aircraft as performing to specification, nothing more. The fiction was paper thin, but in the military world of plausible deniability, thin fictions could be enough. What mattered was that no one could prove unauthorized work had been done without tearing every aircraft down to its components, a process that would take weeks and ground the entire force. Major General Breckinridge arrived exactly on schedule, stepping from a C-47 transport into the desert heat, with the bearing of a man who had spent 30 years in uniform and intended to spend 30 more. He was tall, lean, his face carved into permanent lines of disapproval by decades of enforcing regulations on subordinates who constantly tested their limits. 2 lieutenant colonels accompanied him, both engineers from Wright Field,
both carrying thick folders of specifications and performance data. The inspection began with a review of maintenance logs in the commander's office. Breckenridge's engineers spread documents across a conference table, cross-referencing entries, checking dates against operational reports, looking for patterns that might indicate unauthorized work. Unauthorized activity. They found nothing. The logs were immaculate, every entry properly formatted, every signature in place, every piece of routine maintenance documented according to procedure. If modifications had been made, they left no paper trail. Next came physical inspection of the aircraft themselves. Breckenridge and his team moved through the flight line, selecting P-38s at random for detailed examination. Mechanics stood nearby, tools ready, prepared to open any panel or access any system on command. The general's engineers crawled through engines, traced fuel lines, examined turbochargers, measured tolerances. They spent 40 minutes on each aircraft, their inspection systematic and thorough. They found nothing. The modifications were simply too well hidden, integrated too seamlessly into systems that looked entirely standard to anyone who did not know exactly where to look. After examining 6 aircraft without discovering irregularities, the engineers began to show signs of frustration. They had been sent to find proof of unauthorized work, but the evidence refused to materialize. The reports had to be based on facts, not suspicions, and the facts stubbornly supported the conclusion that these P-38s were entirely standard. Breckenridge changed tactics. If the aircraft revealed nothing, perhaps the pilots would. He ordered a formation of 12 P-38s to take off and demonstrate their capabilities at high altitude. He would observe from the ground while his engineers monitored radio communications and tracked performance. Any anomalies would be documented and investigated. The trap was elegantly simple. If the aircraft truly were unmodified, they would perform to known specifications. If they had been altered, their performance would betray that fact regardless of what maintenance logs claimed. Lieutenant Marcus Webb was among the pilots selected for the demonstration flight. As he strapped into his cockpit, he understood exactly what was being asked: fly normally, using only standard procedures, and the general would see performance that matched his expectations. But flying normally meant accepting the limitations that Dietrich's modification had eliminated. It meant climbing to altitude with the knowledge that engines might fail and the aircraft would lose power precisely when it was most needed. Webb made his choice during the takeoff roll. The bypass valve stayed engaged. The mixture ran rich, flooding the engines with fuel they were not designed to consume in such quantities. If this was to be a demonstration, let it be a demonstration of what the P-38 could actually accomplish when freed from constraints that existed only in engineering manuals. The formation climbed through scattered clouds, 12 aircraft ascending in perfect order toward the thin, cold air where battles were decided. At 15,000 feet, Webb glanced at his instrument panel. Engine temperatures were higher than normal, but well within tolerance. Manifold pressure was good, oil pressure steady. Everything that mattered showed green. At 20,000 feet, one of the unmodified P-38s began to lag. Its pilot reported rough running in the left engine, a familiar problem that every P-38 flyer knew too well. The aircraft fell back from formation, struggling to maintain altitude. Webb watched it happen and said nothing. His own engines purred smoothly, their power undiminished by the altitude. 25,000 feet. Another unmodified P-38 dropped out, both engines coughing, as turbochargers began to ice over. The pilot's voice crackled over the radio, tight with the controlled fear of a man watching his aircraft fail beneath him. He requested permission to return to base. Permission was granted. The formation continued climbing with 10 aircraft instead of 12. At 28,000 feet, the difference became impossible to ignore. The 6 aircraft with Dietrich's modifications held formation easily, their engines running smoothly at an altitude where they should have been struggling. The 4 unmodified P-38s were strung out behind, their pilots fighting to coax performance from engines that simply could not deliver at such heights. The contrast was stark, undeniable, a visual proof that something was different even if inspections had found nothing. Breckenridge watched from the ground through binoculars, his engineers beside him with stopwatches and clipboards. They tracked climb rates, noted which aircraft maintained formation and which fell behind, documented every detail of what they were witnessing. When the formation finally leveled off and began the series of high-speed runs, the general lowered his binoculars and turned to his senior engineer with a single question: How many 6 aircrafts performing significantly better than the other 4 when all 12 were supposedly identical? The engineer had no answer that did not involve unauthorized modifications. But without physical evidence, without documentation, without anything concrete beyond performance that exceeded specifications, he could not make accusations that would stand up to scrutiny. The chain of reasoning was clear. These aircraft had been modified, but proving it required finding the modifications, and 3 days of intensive searching had produced nothing. When the demonstration flight landed, Breckenridge was waiting on the flight line. He approached Webb directly, ignoring protocol that should have directed him to speak with the squadron commander first. The general asked one question: what was different about his aircraft compared to the others in the formation? Webb considered his response carefully. He could lie outright, claiming ignorance of any differences. He could deflect, suggesting that perhaps his aircraft simply ran better than average. Or he could tell the truth and accept whatever consequences followed. He chose a middle path, one that acknowledged reality without quite admitting guilt. His aircraft, Webb said, had received some additional attention from the maintenance crew. Minor adjustments to fuel flow, small modifications to improve reliability at altitude. Nothing that violated specifications, merely optimizations within the parameters the engine could safely handle. He had found that running a slightly richer mixture at high altitude improved performance without causing damage. Other pilots had discovered the same thing through experimentation. Breckenridge listened without interruption, his face revealing nothing. When Webb finished, the general thanked him for his candor and dismissed him. Then Breckenridge walked across the flight line to where Samuel Dietrich stood near a maintenance hangar, watching the conversation from a distance. Their eyes met. No words were exchanged. None were necessary. Both men understood that a reckoning had arrived. The meeting took place in the base commander's office that evening. Present were Breckenridge, his 2 engineering officers, the base commander, the squadron operations officer, and Samuel Dietrich. No stenographer recorded the discussion. No official minutes were kept. What was said in that room would remain between the men who heard it, a conversation that existed in the gray spaces where military necessity met institutional authority. Breckenridge opened by stating facts. 6 P-38s had demonstrated performance that exceeded known capabilities. Physical inspection had found no obvious modifications. Pilot testimony suggested that improvements had been made through unspecified adjustments to fuel systems. As a civilian contractor, Dietrich had access to these aircraft and the technical knowledge to perform such work. The conclusion was inescapable, even if proof remained elusive. Dietrich did not deny the accusation. Instead, he asked a question. How many pilots had been lost to engine failures at high altitude before these adjustments were made? How many more would die if the aircraft were returned to standard configuration while proper modifications worked their way through official channels? What was the value of regulations that killed men while protecting institutional procedures? The engineering officers objected immediately. Regulations existed to ensure safety, to prevent hasty changes that might cause catastrophic failures. Every modification had to be tested exhaustively before implementation. Shortcuts were dangerous, potentially fatal. The fact that Dietrich's work had not yet caused disasters did not mean it was safe. It meant only that luck had held so far. Dietrich responded with data he had been collecting for months. Engine temperatures from modified aircraft compared to standard ones, failure rates, performance metrics, pilot testimonials. He had documented everything, creating an unofficial engineering study that rivaled anything Wright Field might produce. His modifications were not guesswork. They were based on sound mechanical principles, tested through hundreds of flight hours, and proven in combat conditions no laboratory could replicate. The argument continued for 2 hours, positions hardening on both sides. The engineers insisted that proper procedure had to be followed regardless of results. Dietrich maintained that men's lives mattered more than paperwork. The base commander remained silent, caught between loyalty to his pilots and respect for the chain of command that demanded compliance with regulations. Finally, Breckenridge raised a hand for silence. He had listened to both arguments and reached a conclusion. The modifications would not be removed from aircraft that currently carried them. However, no additional modifications would be performed without explicit authorization. Dietrich would document his work completely, providing detailed technical specifications that Wright Field could evaluate. If his modifications proved sound under laboratory testing, they would be incorporated into official maintenance procedures. If they proved flawed, all modified aircraft would be grounded immediately and returned to standard configuration. It was a compromise that satisfied no one, but allowed everyone to claim a partial victory. Dietrich kept his modifications in place. The engineers got their documentation and the promise of proper evaluation. The pilots retained aircraft they trusted. The regulations were bent but not broken, their authority acknowledged even as they were temporarily set aside in deference to combat necessity. The general departed the next morning with a briefcase full of technical drawings and a report that carefully avoided mentioning unauthorized modifications while noting significant performance improvements achieved through innovative maintenance practices. His engineers spent the flight back to Algiers reviewing Dietrich's documentation, grudgingly impressed by the thoroughness of work performed by a man with no formal engineering degree. For Dietrich, the confrontation marked a turning point. He was no longer operating in shadows, gambling that his work would remain hidden. Now his modifications existed in an awkward official limbo, neither approved nor forbidden, tolerated because they worked and because removing them would endanger pilots. It was not the outcome he had hoped for, but it was better than he had feared. The real test came 3 weeks later over the Italian coast. A formation of P-38s was escorting B-17 bombers to targets near Naples when they encountered a Stoffel of Messerschmitt 109s at 27,000 feet. The German fighters climbed aggressively, expecting to engage opponents whose engines would be gasping at that altitude. Instead, they found lightnings that accelerated to meet them, that maneuvered with authority at heights where control should have been sluggish. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.